Imagine a stark scene unfolding in March of 1943, as Lieutenant James Howard gazes intently from the confines of his B-17 Flying Fortress, suspended at a dizzying 23,000 feet above the subjugated territories of France. His dedicated aircrew had just endured an arduous 8-hour journey, battling frigid atmospheric conditions and eluding relentless German fighter aircraft, all to reach a vital ball-bearing manufacturing facility situated perilously close to the historic city of Paris. With a tone of resolute assurance, the bombardier's voice cuts through the intercom, declaring, "Bombs away!" Merely 30 seconds later, Howard, peering through his specialized binoculars, witnesses a disheartening spectacle. Their entire destructive payload, a dozen 500-pound bombs, detonates harmlessly, scattering its force across a verdant wheat field approximately half a mile distant from their designated objective. Their disheartening experience was far from unique. Among the formidable aerial armada of 228 bombers participating in that day's mission, a mere 19 managed to achieve any discernible impact even remotely near their intended targets. This translated to a dismal 8% success rate, a figure that, astonishingly, was often considered a rather favorable outcome during those trying times. The unvarnished truth concerning American strategic bombing efforts in the nascent stages of World War II was utterly unforgiving, and a pervasive reluctance to discuss this grim reality permeated the military establishment. Back in the hallowed halls of Washington, high-ranking generals confidently assured members of Congress that the strategy of precision daylight bombing would unequivocally secure victory in the global conflict. They presented meticulously prepared charts, sophisticated predictive models, and exuded an air of unwavering conviction. However, over the embattled skies of Europe, the brave flight crews were confronting a brutal and undeniable reality, attempting to accurately deliver ordnance from an altitude of 4 miles while hurtling through the air at 180 miles per hour, all while under relentless assault from enemy fighters and amidst the explosive chaos of anti-aircraft fire, rendered true bombing accuracy virtually unattainable. The strategists within the Army Air Forces had meticulously calculated that an approximate circular error probable, CP, of about 1,000 feet would be requisite for effectively neutralizing industrial targets. In simpler, more accessible terms, this critical metric implied that at least half of the deployed bombs needed to impact within a 1,000-foot radius of the designated aiming point. On paper, this objective appeared entirely plausible, and within the realm of reasonable expectation. However, the grim reality proved to be quite the opposite. By the summer of 1943, the actual CP for the missions undertaken by the venerable 8th Air Force consistently hovered around an alarming 3,200 feet. Disturbingly, some missions recorded even more catastrophic deviations, exhibiting accuracy rates that were considerably, indeed profoundly worse. During the harrowing inaugural Schweinfurt raid in August of 1943, the combined bomber force unleashed an immense deluge of 724 tons of high explosives upon the crucial ball-bearing factories that were responsible for supplying a staggering 40% of Germany's total production capacity. Subsequent post-mission reconnaissance meticulously revealed that less than 200 tons of this destructive power actually struck within the confines of the sprawling factory complex. The overwhelming remainder of the ordnance indiscriminately gouged craters into residential neighborhoods, rural fields, and even tragically impacted a venerable medieval church situated 3 miles away. A devastating toll was exacted that day. 60 bombers were mercilessly shot down, resulting in the tragic loss or capture of 600 brave airmen. Yet, with remarkable resilience, the targeted factories were fully operational and back to their pre-raid production levels within a mere 6 weeks. The flight crews, in a grim acknowledgment of the prevailing bombing tactics, began to derisively refer to their approach as the aluminum cloud approach, a moniker that starkly encapsulated the essence of their operational reality. The procedure mandated flying in exceptionally tight formations, placing an almost desperate reliance on the presumed competence of the lead bombardier, and then, at the precise moment he released his bombs, every other aircraft in the formation would immediately toggle their own payloads. The theoretical underpinning of this strategy posited that even if individual bombs deviated from their intended trajectories, the sheer, overwhelming volume of ordnance would collectively saturate and ultimately neutralize the target. However, German industrial complexes were not, in fact, sprawling, enormous entities. A typical synthetic oil plant, for instance, might encompass an area of approximately 40 acres. This might sound substantial until one grasps the sobering fact that with an accuracy rate hovering around 3,000 feet, the dispersal pattern of the bombs was effectively spreading across an immense 300 acres. In essence, the Allied forces were engaging in a form of indiscriminate carpet bombing, desperately hoping that something of critical importance would inadvertently be struck. The profound human cost associated with these missions exacerbated the already dire situation. Each sortie demanded that 10-man crews navigate through veritable walls of anti-aircraft fire. Those ominous black puffs of exploding 88mm shells that possessed the terrifying capability to shred a bomber's robust aluminum skin as if it were mere tissue paper. Crew survival rates throughout 1943 were nothing short of horrifying. Statistically, a bomber crew faced a grim 1 in 4 probability of completing their mandatory 25 missions. And for what ultimate purpose? To witness their meticulously aimed bombs vanish into obscuring cloud cover, or, even more agonizingly, to observe them strike, knowing full well that they had just obliterated a residential block while the critical factory immediately adjacent continued its operations unimpeded. Morale among the airmen was plummeting with alarming rapidity, arguably even faster than the bombing campaign itself was progressing. The Norden bomb sight was initially heralded as a revolutionary device poised to fundamentally alter the dynamics of aerial warfare. Should one ever ponder the persistent question of why American bombers steadfastly adhered to their perilous daylight missions, while their British counterparts, with commendable prudence, transitioned to the relative safety of night bombing, the Norden bomb sight unequivocally provides the definitive explanation. This intricate apparatus, formally designated as the Mark 15 Norden bomb sight, was essentially a sophisticated mechanical analog computer, tipping the scales at a substantial 50 pounds and commanding an exorbitant price tag of $8,000 per individual unit. To contextualize this figure, in 1943, that sum exceeded the cost of most residential homes. The Army Air Forces harbored such an intense obsession with this particular piece of technology that they allocated an astronomical $1.5 billion towards its development and subsequent production, thereby establishing it as one of America's most financially demanding weapons programs. For a stark comparison, the entirety of the clandestine Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, ultimately cost $2 billion. Carl Norden, a brilliant Swiss engineer based in New York, had conceived and meticulously designed this optical computing marvel during the 1920s, grounding his creation in a truly ingenious conceptual framework. The bombardier would position himself prone within the aircraft's nose compartment, carefully peering through the sight's eyepiece, and then manually track the designated target. Concurrently, the bomb sight would autonomously calculate crucial flight parameters such as wind drift, current altitude, prevailing airspeed, and the projected trajectory. This is where the device's sophistication truly became apparent. The sight was seamlessly integrated and wired directly into the aircraft's autopilot system. During the critical bombing run, the bombardier possessed the capability to enact precise corrections utilizing a dedicated control panel, and in a truly remarkable feat of engineering, the bomb sight itself would physically steer the airplane to meticulously compensate for any lateral wind drift. In theory, this innovative system promised an unparalleled degree of accuracy, colloquially termed pickle barrel accuracy. Public demonstrations conducted by the Army showcased bombardiers successfully dropping practice bombs into remarkably small 100-foot circles from an astonishing altitude of 20,000 feet. Promotional materials boldly asserted, in quite literal terms, that one could accurately drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from a distance of 4 miles up. The security protocols surrounding the Norden sites were characterized by an almost pathological level of paranoia. Bombardiers were required to take a solemn, formal oath, entirely separate from their standard military oath, pledging never to divulge any information whatsoever concerning the device. Prior to each mission, an armed guard would meticulously transport the bomb sight to the waiting aircraft, secured within a robust, locked case. In the dire event that the bomber was incapacitated and plummeting, the bombardier's explicit and unyielding orders were to utterly destroy the site using a thermite grenade before making their desperate escape by bailing out. Tragically, several bombardiers made the ultimate sacrifice attempting to adhere to these stringent directives, remaining with their burning aircraft for dangerously extended periods, while desperately endeavoring to melt their Norden sights. The military genuinely harbored the profound conviction that if a single Norden sight were to fall into German hands, the enemy would swiftly replicate its design, thereby causing America's crucial strategic advantage to vanish overnight. Herein lies the crushing irony of the situation. The German intelligence apparatus had already acquired the Norden's closely guarded secrets and, remarkably, harbored no particular interest in them. A German spy named Hermann Lang had successfully pilfered the complete blueprints in 1938. German engineers, upon reviewing the stolen designs, simply shrugged with indifference and reverted their focus to their own indigenous Luftwaffe 7 bomb sight design. The pivotal question then arises: why such a dismissive reaction? The answer lay in a crucial realization they had already made, a harsh truth that American flight crews were agonizingly about to discover through bitter experience. The vaunted precision of the Norden was, in essence, entirely theoretical. Its optimal performance predicated a utopian scenario: unlimited time directly over the target, an absolute absence of defensive fire, flawless visibility, and perfectly stable atmospheric conditions. The brutal reality of combat operations over Europe offered precisely none of these indispensable prerequisites. The initial, stark reality check for the Norden's purported capabilities emerged directly from the nature of the targets themselves. German factory complexes were not passive, vulnerable entities situated in open, undefended fields. They were meticulously equipped with sophisticated smoke generators, capable of enveloping entire industrial zones in a dense, obscuring blanket of artificial fog within a mere 5 minutes of an alarm being raised. By the latter half of 1943, German defensive doctrine mandated that every significant target possess sufficient smoke-generating capacity to completely obscure visibility for a minimum duration of 30 minutes. Consequently, bombardiers would spend the entirety of their approach meticulously observing their target with crystal clarity. Then, at the most critical juncture, with a sudden poof, the target would utterly vanish beneath an impenetrable shroud of artificial fog. At this point, the bombardier was reduced to mere guesswork, and the highly advanced Norden bomb sight, for all its computational prowess, possessed no capacity to compute a best guess. Furthermore, the very nature of aerial combat itself presented an insurmountable challenge. The Norden system necessitated a perfectly straight and level bombing run of at least 3 minutes to accurately execute its complex calculations. 3 minutes of flying in a straight and level trajectory over German territory equated to 3 minutes of presenting oneself as an utterly predictable and vulnerable target for every single anti-aircraft gun positioned below. Pilots quickly assimilated the brutal lesson that undertaking evasive maneuvers, while crucial for survival, rendered the Norden bomb sight utterly useless. The intricate device simply could not compensate for abrupt changes in altitude or sudden, sharp turns. Thus, flight crews were confronted with an impossible, agonizing dilemma: either maintain a steady course and face almost certain death, or execute evasive maneuvers and inevitably miss the target. German flak gunners were not merely firing at American bombers. They were engaged in an operation of industrial-scale execution. By 1943, Germany had painstakingly constructed the most sophisticated and lethal anti-aircraft defense network ever conceived in human history, and this formidable system was utterly decimating the 8th Air Force. The formidable backbone of this defensive apparatus was the iconic 88mm flak gun, correctly identified as the Flak 18/36/37, depending on its specific variant. While the 88 is widely recognized for its devastating effectiveness as a tank killer, its primary and most crucial role was the systematic destruction of enemy bombers. Germany's industrial might produced approximately 21,000 of these formidable weapons throughout the war, and an estimated 10,000 of them were strategically positioned, forming an impenetrable ring of fire around vital strategic targets across occupied Europe. What rendered the 88 so exceptionally terrifying was its devastating operational capability. It could propel a potent 20-pound high-explosive shell to an astonishing altitude of 32,000 feet, delivering this destructive force at a blistering rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Each individual shell was meticulously fitted with a time-delay fuse, which German crews would manually and precisely set based on the incoming bomber's detected altitude. The shell would then ascend, reaching its predetermined height, and detonate into a maelstrom of thousands of razor-sharp fragments, hurtling through the air at supersonic velocities. A single fragment, no larger than a human thumb, possessed the terrifying power to effortlessly punch through a bomber's aluminum skin, sever critical control cables, rupture vital fuel tanks, or instantly kill a crew member. Crucially, German gunners were not firing these shells in isolation. They were operating in coordinated batteries. A typical German industrial target, such as those found in the heavily industrialized Ruhr Valley, would be defended by an array of 40 to 60 heavy flak guns, strategically positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Advanced fire control radar systems, specifically the Würzburg system, possess the capability to track incoming bomber formations from an impressive distance of 40 miles out, continuously feeding vital target data to sophisticated gun calculators. The Germans had, in essence, deployed mechanical computers at each battery, which would rapidly crunch complex data pertaining to altitude, speed, and heading, subsequently spitting out precise firing solutions. This advanced technological integration enabled German crews to accurately set their fuses and commence firing even before the American bombers had visually acquired their target. During a major bombing raid, the sky would be inundated with hundreds of guns unleashing thousands upon thousands of shells, collectively creating what bomber crews chillingly dubbed flak fields, entire sectors of the sky that transformed into an opaque, menacing black expanse of explosions. The underlying mathematics of this grim reality were starkly simple and brutally unforgiving. If an aircraft navigated through intense flak at an altitude of 18,000 feet, it was operating squarely within the optimal kill zone, where German guns achieved their highest degree of accuracy. At such altitudes, flight crews vividly reported encountering flak bursts so dense and pervasive that it became utterly impossible to discern anything beyond them. The cacophony within the aircraft was likened to being trapped inside a massive metal drum while someone relentlessly hammered upon it. Survivors recounted the experience as a continuous, thunderous roar interspersed with the distinct, metallic ping of shrapnel violently impacting the aircraft's fuselage. Navigator John Morris, a member of the 301st Bomb Group, penned a poignant entry in his diary following a mission to Bremen. "Counted 127 holes in our ship. Don't know how we made it. Jenkins bled out in the waist before we crossed the channel. He was 19. American strategists, facing persistent challenges, consequently adopted what appeared to be a rational course of action, escalating their operational altitude. By the middle of 1943, bomber formations routinely ascended to between 25,000 and 27,000 feet, occasionally even venturing up to 30,000 feet. At these stratospheric levels, aircraft were largely immune to the effective reach of most anti-aircraft artillery, and German fighter planes struggled significantly with their performance capabilities in the extreme thinness of the upper atmosphere. The inherent drawback, however, was formidable. At 25,000 feet, ambient temperatures plummeted to a bone-chilling -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air density was so minimal that even with highly supercharged engines, aircraft suffered a marked degradation in performance. Crews required specialized heated flight suits and constant oxygen supplies simply to survive. Yet, the most detrimental consequence was the impact of such altitudes on bombing accuracy. The much-touted Norden bombsight, once promising pickle-barrel precision at 25,000 feet, found every variable that complicated bombing at 18,000 feet amplified to an exponentially greater degree. The situation only deteriorated. Wind velocities at these elevated levels were not the moderate 20 or 30 miles per hour encountered at lower altitudes. Instead, they raged at 80, 100, and sometimes even 120 miles per hour. The very existence of jet streams was not yet understood by meteorologists or aviators. Crews simply observed with frustration as their dropped ordnance would sometimes drift laterally for miles, rendering any attempt at precision futile. Furthermore, visibility became profoundly unreliable. Clouds that appeared diaphanous and inconsequential from above often completely obscured ground targets. Compounding these issues, temperature inversions created distinct atmospheric layers that refracted light, making accurate sighting through the Norden instrument virtually impossible. The offset bombing technique was not a product of deliberate planning or strategic foresight. Its genesis lay in a confluence of desperation, widespread confusion, and a crucial error made by a single navigator during a mission over Schweinfurt in October 1943. This particular operation, the second major raid targeting Schweinfurt's vital ball-bearing manufacturing facilities, was already unfolding as an unmitigated catastrophe. Of the 291 bombers dispatched, a staggering 60 were shot down, and an additional 17 sustained such extensive damage that they were permanently grounded, never to fly again. This represented a horrifying 26% loss rate in a solitary combat sortie. Nevertheless, nestled within the voluminous post-mission reports was an intriguing anomaly. One particular unit, the 305th Bomb Group, had inadvertently approached its initial point, the designated location where the final bombing run commences, from an incorrect vector. Rather than adhering to the prescribed north-to-south attack axis, they had inadvertently entered the target area from the northeast, at an approximate 40-degree angle relative to the objective. The cause of this deviation was attributed to their navigator, Captain Robert Williams, who had miscalculated a critical wind correction during the inbound leg of their flight. By the time the lead pilot of the 305th Group recognized their navigational error, the formation was already irrevocably committed to the trajectory. Turning a tightly packed formation of 18 heavy bombers on a dime was an impractical, if not impossible, maneuver, especially amidst the relentless onslaught of swarming German fighter aircraft. Consequently, Captain Williams was compelled to make an instantaneous, on-the-spot decision. He instructed his bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, to utilize the crosswind correction knobs on the Norden bombsight, but with a crucial modification: to deliberately offset the designated aiming point to the right of the factory complex itself. Essentially, instead of directing his aim precisely at the intended target and relying on the bombsight to mechanically compute for wind drift, Lieutenant Murphy deliberately targeted an empty expanse of ground adjacent to the factory, allowing the prevailing winds to carry the released bombs back onto the actual objective. The efficacy of this improvised method was meticulously documented by the strike cameras embedded in every bomber. While the majority of other bomb groups on that fateful day achieved their typical hit rates, generally ranging from a meager 8 to 12%, the 305th's ordnance, astonishingly, walked directly through the central core of the factory complex. A remarkable 42% of their bombs struck within the designated target area. Initially, military analysts dismissed this extraordinary outcome as nothing more than a stroke of pure luck or random chance. However, Captain Williams vehemently asserted that the success was far from arbitrary, and he possessed the mathematical evidence to substantiate his claim. He explained that the Norden bombsight, despite its advanced design, harbored a fundamental conceptual flaw that severely compromised accuracy at high altitudes. It was predicated on the assumption that an aircraft would be flying directly along its target line, with wind acting solely as either a headwind, pushing from the front, or a tailwind, pushing from the rear. The sight's drift correction mechanisms were exclusively engineered to account for these longitudinal wind components. Yet, at an operational altitude of 25,000 feet over wartime Germany, winds were almost never perfectly aligned with the bomber's flight path. Instead, they predominantly emanated from the side, exerting a lateral force that effectively pushed the entire aircraft sideways through the air. This phenomenon created what is technically known as a crab angle. To maintain a straight ground track, the desired path over the terrain, the aircraft's nose would have to point slightly into the oncoming wind, much like a pedestrian leaning into a strong side breeze while attempting to walk a straight line. The inherent difficulty arose when bombs were released from an aircraft flying at a crab angle. They simultaneously inherited both the aircraft's forward velocity and its sideways drift. While the Norden bombsight was exceptionally proficient at calculating the forward trajectory, its compensation for side drift erroneously assumed that the aircraft was maintaining a direct heading towards the target. When this was not the case, when the aircraft was crabbing into a crosswind, the bombsight's internal calculations became fundamentally flawed, resulting in impact points hundreds of feet away from the intended aim. Crucially, the stronger the crosswind, the more pronounced this error became. And at 25,000 feet, robust crosswinds were an almost constant environmental factor. Captain Williams's accidental revelation was both remarkably simple and profoundly revolutionary. If a bomber deliberately approached its target at an angle to the anticipated wind direction and simultaneously offset its aiming point perpendicular to its flight path, the prevailing crosswind could be ingeniously utilized to guide the bombs precisely onto the target. This paradigm shift meant that instead of battling against the disruptive forces of wind drift, the aircrews effectively weaponized it, turning an adversary into an ally. The bombardiers' revised procedure involved identifying a specific reference point, perhaps a distinct road intersection, a prominent river bend, or a unique building that was situated directly crosswind from the actual primary target. He would then meticulously aim at this secondary reference point. As the bombs commenced their 4-mile descent through the atmosphere, the relentless crosswind would predictably propel them sideways, guiding them towards the true target. The inherent brilliance of this methodology lay in its geometric precision. At an optimal offset angle of 40 to 50 degrees, the wind performed the majority of the corrective work. The bombs would drift with remarkable predictability, and because this drift was meticulously accounted for from the very outset, the resulting dispersion pattern of the ordnance tightened dramatically. In stark contrast to bombs scattering in an elongated oval shape along the aircraft's flight path, this technique ensured they would track laterally in a concentrated, precise line. It was undeniably counterintuitive. Bombardiers were deliberately aiming away from the very objective they wished to strike. However, the underlying physics were irrefutable. While the mathematical principles governing offset bombing were not overly complex, they necessitated a complete reevaluation and mental rewiring of how bombardiers approached the entire problem of target acquisition and ordnance delivery. Traditional bombing doctrine had rigidly dictated, aim directly at the target, and allow the Norden bombsight to compute all other variables. Offset bombing, in its radical departure, declared, for a moment, disregard the target, concentrate instead on the wind triangle. Every bombardier had been introduced to the concept of wind triangles during their navigation schooling, but for most, these remained largely theoretical exercises. Now, these very same triangles represented the critical distinction between successfully destroying an enemy factory and inadvertently obliterating a civilian hospital 3 city blocks away. To illustrate the practical application of this mathematics, consider a scenario. An aircraft flying at 25,000 feet with a ground speed of 180 miles per hour, encountering a 90-mile-per-hour crosswind blowing from west to east. The bombs, once released, would take approximately 60 seconds to descend from their release point to impact, a full minute of crucial drift time. In that minute, the aircraft's forward momentum would carry the bombs roughly 3 miles along its flight path. Simultaneously, the 90-mile-per-hour crosswind would push them sideways, resulting in a lateral drift of 1.5 miles. Without the innovative offset correction, aiming directly at the factory would cause the bombs to land 1.5 miles to the east, indiscriminately striking whatever structures happened to be in that unintended location. The offset solution fundamentally inverted this equation. Instead of flying a direct course towards the factory, the aircraft would approach at a 40 to 50 degree angle from the west, strategically positioning the wind on its left side to gently propel it towards the target. The bombardier would then meticulously identify an offset aiming point, for instance, a specific railroad yard position precisely where the crosswind would initiate the bomb's lateral journey. He would then track this railroad yard through the Norden site, input the calculated crosswind drift angle into the computer, and release the ordnance. The bombs would depart the aircraft, begin their descent, and the persistent crosswind would effectively push them from their initial trajectory over the railroad yard directly towards the factory. If the intricate calculations were precise, the bombs would arrive at the factory's location precisely at the moment of impact. The accurate measurement of wind speed thus became an absolutely paramount factor, and this is where further ingenuity emerged. Navigators began employing a sophisticated technique known as the double drift method during the critical bomb run approach. This involved taking 2 distinct drift readings at separate points along the path to the target, essentially quantifying the extent to which the prevailing wind was pushing the aircraft off its intended course. By carefully comparing these two readings, navigators could calculate the precise wind speed and direction with astonishing accuracy. Highly skilled navigators were capable of obtaining wind data within a mere 5 miles per hour of the actual atmospheric conditions, and this level of precision proved entirely sufficient to render offset bombing an effective and reliable strategy. The resultant improvement in bombing accuracy was nothing short of staggering. Testing conducted by the 8th Air Force in late 1943 unequivocally demonstrated that offset approaches, executed at 45-degree angles, dramatically reduced the circular error probable, CP, from an average of 3,200 feet down to approximately 1,100 feet. This figure almost perfectly aligned with the demanding 1,000-foot accuracy threshold that military planners had originally stipulated. Furthermore, some exceptionally proficient bombardier navigator teams were even achieving an impressive 800-foot accuracy on days with clear visibility. While such figures may not seem particularly impressive when compared to modern GPS-guided munitions that can strike within 15 feet of their target, in the context of 1943 aerial warfare, this represented a truly revolutionary leap forward. It fundamentally meant that bombs were now consistently hitting inside the confines of the factory complex, rather than indiscriminately scattering across the surrounding countryside. The successful implementation of this sophisticated technique demanded an intense and seamless coordination among 3 crucial crew members: the navigator, the bombardier, and the pilot. The navigator bore the critical responsibility of flawlessly executing the wind calculations and precisely identifying the correct offset aiming point. The bombardier, in turn, had to place absolute trust in those calculations, meticulously tracking a reference point that his every instinct likely screamed was not the true target. And the pilot, under immense pressure, was required to maintain an unwavering heading and altitude, even as anti-aircraft flak exploded violently around his aircraft, and every fiber of his being urged him to initiate evasive maneuvers. A single misstep in this intricate chain of command and execution would inevitably revert the bombing operation back to the realm of random, imprecise ordnance delivery. The immediate consequence of abandoning precision was a reversion to indiscriminate aerial bombardment. The primary impediment to widespread adoption quickly emerged as the necessity for extensive and specialized training. Bombardiers, having diligently honed their precision over countless hours to strike targets with direct visual alignment, were now faced with the counterintuitive challenge of abandoning that ingrained methodology. This cognitive recalibration was akin to instructing a seasoned basketball player to disregard the hoop itself and instead focus on the backboard. The inherent mental resistance against such a fundamental shift proved formidable at every stage of the process. To address this pedagogical hurdle, the Army Air Forces established dedicated training institutions situated in the geographically diverse locales of Florida and Arizona, where aircrews engaged in simulated offset bombing runs, meticulously targeting meticulously constructed replicas of German industrial complexes. These aerial maneuvers were reiterated scores of times, allowing the intricate geometric principles governing the offset technique to become deeply ingrained and instinctively understood by the flying personnel. Even experienced aircrews, who had already distinguished themselves by completing arduous combat missions, were recalled to England for this crucial retraining initiative, a testament to the profound gravity with which the High Command regarded the successful implementation of this novel strategy. As the calendar turned to January 1944, the 8th Air Force found itself grappling with an enviable predicament, one that most other military or civilian organizations would eagerly covet: the undeniable revelation of an operational methodology that demonstrably yielded effective results. The subsequent challenge, however, was monumental. To seamlessly integrate this groundbreaking technique across a vast human mosaic comprising 12,000 personnel, dispersed across an impressive 40 distinct airfields spanning the English landscape, all while simultaneously prosecuting a relentless global conflict. General James Doolittle, having assumed the formidable leadership of the 8th Air Force in that same pivotal month of January, meticulously reviewed the compelling data pertaining to offset bombing and, recognizing its immense potential, immediately elevated its mastery to the paramount position among all training imperatives. Consequently, he issued a directive to his operations officer, Brigadier General Fred Anderson, assigning him the seemingly impossible task of comprehensively retraining every single bombardier and navigator within the entire theater of operations, granting a mere 6-week window for this Herculean endeavor. General Anderson's initial reaction to this staggering mandate was, by all accounts, an expletive-laden outburst deemed unsuitable for official record, yet, despite the audacious timeline, he ultimately rose to the occasion and meticulously executed the mission. The meticulously structured retraining initiative commenced with a focused emphasis on the lead crews, comprising the most seasoned and adept bombardiers and navigators, individuals entrusted with piloting the vanguard aircraft within each aerial formation. Given their critical role as the navigational and targeting pace-setters for the entire squadron, it was imperative that these elite personnel attain complete mastery of the intricate offset techniques before broader implementation. To facilitate this intensive learning, dedicated instructional facilities were expeditiously established at every single bomber base, employing a dual-pronged pedagogical approach encompassing both rigorous classroom instruction and extensive practical flight exercises conducted over the designated English coastal ranges. These theoretical sessions delved deeply into complex subjects such as wind triangles, precise drift calculations, and the nuanced principles of offset geometry, continuing relentlessly until the aircrews could execute the requisite mathematical computations with an almost somnambulistic proficiency. Following this foundational academic grounding, the practical phase of aerial execution commenced. A significant hurdle impeding the training regimen was the notoriously inclement climate of England during the winter months, which presented exceedingly adverse conditions for practical exercises. Persistent and pervasive cloud cover frequently obscured visibility, while atmospheric winds exhibited a highly erratic and capricious nature, further compounded by the severely curtailed hours of daylight characteristic of the season. Paradoxically, however, these formidable environmental obstacles proved beneficial in an unexpected manner. The successful execution of bombing runs amid such challenging English meteorological conditions instilled a profound confidence, suggesting that the comparatively less severe German weather would be entirely surmountable. Consequently, aircrews routinely departed their bases at the break of dawn, navigating towards designated bombing ranges situated off the coastline, where they meticulously performed their offset practice runs, targeting either buoyant floating markers or decommissioned naval vessels. The airmen participating in this initiative were subjected to an exceptionally demanding training regimen, requiring them to complete a minimum of 3 dedicated practice missions before they could attain official certification for deploying the offset bombing technique in actual combat scenarios. Indeed, a segment of the trainees required as many as 10 missions before they could genuinely internalize and proficiently execute the complex nuances of the method. A pivotal factor contributing to the remarkable efficacy of this retraining paradigm was the instructional dynamic. Battle-hardened combat veterans were directly imparting their invaluable knowledge and practical experience to their fellow combat veterans. This pedagogical approach transcended the conventional academic setting. It was not merely an abstract theoretical exposition delivered by an academy instructor wielding a pointer, but rather a tangible, real-world demonstration by individuals, like Lieutenant Murphy of the 305th Bomb Group, the very officer credited with the fortuitous discovery of offset bombing during the Schweinfurt raid, who personally stood within a frigid Quonset hut, meticulously illustrating the precise actions he undertook. Similarly, Captain Williams assumed responsibility for the navigational components of the instruction, meticulously guiding the trainees through his refined wind calculation methodologies, substantiated by authentic mission data. Whenever student airmen encountered difficulties grappling with the inherently counterintuitive concept of aiming away from their intended targets, the instructors would promptly present compelling strike camera footage derived from recent operational missions, starkly juxtaposing the meager 9% accuracy rate of traditional bombing with the significantly enhanced 38% achieved through offset bombing, rendering the empirical evidence unequivocally persuasive. Simultaneously with the robust training efforts, significant revisions to established operational doctrine were systematically put into effect. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force undertook a comprehensive overhaul of its tactical bombing manuals, integrating the new methodologies. A crucial directive, Field Order 259, formally promulgated on February 20th, explicitly sanctioned the utilization of offset bombing approaches for any and all missions wherein crosswind conditions registered speeds surpassing 40 miles per hour. Furthermore, group commanders were furnished with meticulously prepared and highly detailed briefing packages, which enumerated the most advantageous approach angles specifically tailored for each of Germany's principal strategic targets. To illustrate, it was advised that approaches to Schweinfurt be executed from the northeast at a precise 45-degree angle, whereas the extensive industrial complexes within the Ruhr Valley were most effectively engaged with 50-degree offsets originating from the western direction. This level of granular detail unmistakably indicated a thorough and exhaustive preparatory analysis. Despite the evident advantages and rigorous training, the actual implementation phase encountered certain inherent friction and was not universally seamless. A notable source of opposition emerged from more senior pilots, particularly those who had endured the brutal and costly aerial campaigns of 1943, who demonstrated a profound reluctance to abandon tactical methodologies that they had quite literally paid for with blood and immense sacrifice to master. A widely recounted anecdote from March 1944 vividly illustrates this recalcitrance. A pilot from the 91st Bomb Group defiantly declined to execute an offset approach during a mission targeting Brunswick, steadfastly advocating for the conventional straight-in attack, articulating his rationale with the simple, yet stubborn, declaration, "That's how we've always done it." Predictably, his bombardiers' efforts resulted in the target being missed by a substantial margin of half a mile, and the pilot in question was subsequently, and discreetly, transferred to roles outside of direct combat operations. General Doolittle's unwavering commitment to the new doctrine was unequivocal. Personnel were expected to either embrace adaptation or face removal from frontline responsibilities. By the advent of April 1944, the offset bombing technique had been thoroughly integrated and was firmly established as the standard operating procedure across the 8th Air Force. Consequently, mission briefings were augmented to incorporate specialized sections entirely devoted to comprehensive wind analysis, during which expert meteorologists meticulously furnished anticipated wind velocities and directional vectors specific to the designated bombing altitudes. Furthermore, navigators were supplied with meticulously pre-calculated offset approach headings, derived from the most current meteorological forecasts regarding wind patterns. Should atmospheric conditions deviate from predictions during the course of a mission, navigators were equipped with ready reference lookup tables, enabling them to swiftly and accurately recalculate their parameters while airborne. This comprehensive integration transformed the entire process into a highly systematized methodology, a crucial development that empowered even aircrews of average proficiency to consistently attain bombing accuracies that, in earlier periods, would have exclusively demanded truly exceptional individual skill. The tangible positive outcomes of this strategic shift were almost instantaneously discernible within the operational data. Specifically, in March 1944, the precision of bombing operations witnessed a dramatic surge, with the average circular error probable (CP) across all 8th Air Force missions diminishing to a remarkable 1,250 feet, signifying an impressive 60% enhancement in accuracy compared to the figures recorded in December 1943. Even more significantly, the critical metric of bombs successfully impacting within the designated target areas experienced a substantial increase, escalating from a mere 11% to a considerably more impactful 27%. While this still implied that a substantial 3/4 of the ordnance failed to strike its precise mark, this improvement nonetheless heralded a veritable revolution in operational capability. Industrial facilities that had previously necessitated the cumulative destructive power of 4 or even 5 separate aerial assaults to inflict serious damage could now be effectively neutralized and rendered inoperable within the span of just 2 missions. The monumental D-Day invasion presented offset bombing with its most crucial and definitive trial, under circumstances where the strategic stakes were unequivocally at their absolute zenith. On that historic morning of June 6, 1944, the triumphant execution of the entire Normandy invasion critically hinged upon the capacity of Allied bomber forces to effectively obliterate the formidable German coastal fortifications prior to the arrival of ground troops on the beaches. These defensive structures were far more than mere gun emplacements. They comprised heavily reinforced concrete bunkers, boasting walls a staggering 8 feet in thickness, within which were housed powerful artillery pieces capable of devastating landing craft with lethal precision from distances exceeding 3 miles offshore. Intelligence reports had pinpointed a total of 49 principal battery positions strategically distributed along a critical 50-mile expanse of the coastline, and it was absolutely imperative that each and every one of these strongholds be neutralized, lest thousands of Allied soldiers perish in the treacherous surf upon landing. The critical responsibility for neutralizing the defenses impacting Utah and Omaha beaches fell squarely upon the formidable 8th Air Force. Their operational window was exceptionally narrow, spanning a mere 40 minutes, from 5:50 a.m. to 6:30 a.m., during which they were tasked with delivering an immense payload exceeding 2,900 tons of ordnance upon fortifications collectively occupying an area of less than 2 square miles. This timing was particularly unforgiving, as the mission necessitated bombing during the dim light of dawn, further complicated by meteorological forecasts predicting cloud cover between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. Conventional aerial warfare doctrine unequivocally posited that achieving accurate bombing through dense cloud formations was an impossibility, yet this established tenet was poised for another radical reevaluation. However, the sophisticated application of offset bombing techniques, synergistically coupled with advanced radar navigation aids, had now rendered it theoretically feasible to strike targets that remained entirely invisible to the human eye. The strategic blueprint for this unprecedented operation was meticulously conceived. Specialized Pathfinder aircraft, each outfitted with the innovative H-2X radar system, were designated to spearhead every bomber formation. This advanced radar technology possessed the capability to render a rudimentary, yet sufficiently informative, depiction of the coastline through obscuring cloud layers, achieved by precisely identifying the distinct demarcation lines separating landmass from water. Navigators, leveraging these radar returns, would then discern prominent coastal geographical features, such as the mouths of rivers, extended peninsulas, or characteristic shoreline curvatures, and systematically employ these as their crucial offset reference points. The underlying mathematical computations remained identical to those utilized in traditional visual offset bombing, with the singular, yet profound, difference being that these calculations were now derived from radar returns rather than direct optical observation. The bombardiers, in turn, would meticulously track the designated radar reference point, precisely compute the wind drift that would transport the bombs from that specific point to the intended fortifications, and then execute the ordnance release. The actual execution of these aerial operations on the morning of D-Day was, by all accounts, fraught with considerable disarray and unpredictable challenges. The prevailing cloud cover proved to be significantly more extensive and impenetrable than initially predicted, presenting a solid overcast layer stretching from 2,000 feet up to an alarming 10,000 feet across numerous operational sectors. This necessitated that the bomber formations descend to an altitude of 12,000 feet in an attempt to navigate beneath the most severe weather conditions, thereby inadvertently bringing them within the effective firing range of any German anti-aircraft artillery, flak guns, that had managed to withstand the preceding naval bombardment. Furthermore, the atmospheric wind conditions presented a formidable challenge. Powerful crosswinds, gusting between 25 and 40 miles per hour from the northwest, exerted a relentless force, pushing the aircraft inexorably towards the landing beaches. Paradoxically, this very wind, initially a hindrance, was ultimately transformed into an integral component of the offensive strategy. At the fiercely contested Omaha Beach, the preliminary assessments of the bombing efficacy were, regrettably, characterized as catastrophic failures. The vast majority of the ordnance impacted considerable distances inland, scarring agricultural fields and cratering vital roadways situated well behind the entrenched German defensive positions. Subsequent meticulous analysis conducted after the invasion revealed that a mere 31% of the fortifications at Omaha had sustained direct hits during the preceding aerial assault. However, what these initial, disheartening reports critically failed to account for was the unequivocally devastating effectiveness of the offset bombing approaches successfully employed at Utah Beach. Conversely, at Utah, the bombardiers meticulously employed a precise 45-degree offset angle, initiating their approach from the northeast, strategically utilizing the prevailing crosswinds to propel their ordnance towards the beach. The bombs, delivered with remarkable precision, systematically walked through the enemy battery positions in strikingly linear patterns, successfully collapsing reinforced bunkers and utterly annihilating gun emplacements with an astonishing 89% effectiveness rate. Out of the 28 principal fortifications identified at Utah Beach, an impressive 25 were effectively neutralized and rendered inoperable even before the initial waves of troops made landfall. The striking disparity in outcomes between the operations at Omaha and Utah Beaches ultimately distilled to a critical divergence in the execution of the bombing plans. Specifically, at Omaha, the bombardiers, driven by a profound concern, introduced a deliberate and unauthorized delay into their ordnance release sequence. Their apprehension stemmed from a deep-seated fear of inadvertently striking their own approaching landing craft, prompting them to retain their bombs for an additional, critical few seconds beyond the calculated release moment. This well-intentioned, yet ultimately misguided, adjustment resulted in the bombs impacting a significant 200 to 300 yards inland, turning a noble intention into a catastrophic operational failure. Conversely, at Utah, the bombardiers adhered rigorously to their precisely calculated release points, without incorporating any unauthorized safety delays, placing their unwavering trust in the mathematical accuracy to ensure the bombs landed clear of the beaches. This steadfast adherence to doctrine was richly vindicated. Consequently, when the vanguard of the 4th Infantry Division stormed Utah Beach at precisely 6:30 a.m., they discovered the formidable German defensive positions already reduced to rubble, encountering only negligible resistance, and sustaining remarkably minimal casualties. The initial combat engagements, characterized by minimal casualties, provided crucial insights. This vital lesson was meticulously chronicled in a top-secret analytical report finalized in July 1944. The study revealed that conventional, direct bombing runs over Omaha, even those adjusted for heightened safety protocols, yielded a mere 31% precision in hitting targets. In stark contrast, the innovative offset approaches employed at Utah, executed precisely as pilots had been rigorously trained, achieved an impressive 89% effectiveness. This was far from an insignificant gain. It represented the fundamental distinction between a methodology that barely functioned and one that unequivocally secured overwhelming victories in military operations. The comprehensive report definitively concluded that employing offset bombing strategies had drastically cut the number of aerial assaults necessary to neutralize heavily fortified enemy emplacements by a remarkable factor of 3. By the summer of 1944, virtually every significant Allied aerial bombardment campaign had fully integrated offset techniques as a fundamental operational principle. Pivotal missions, such as the relentless raids targeting French rail yards in anticipation of the impending invasion, the sustained assaults on critical V-1 launch sites, and the deliberate dismantling of Germany's vital oil production infrastructure, all routinely employed offset approaches as their standard methodology. This ingenious technique even transcended traditional organizational divisions within the military. The 9th Air Force's medium bombers, for instance, swiftly adopted it for their tactical strike assignments. Even the venerable RAF Bomber Command, which had previously regarded American claims of precision bombing with profound skepticism, commenced trials with offset methods for their own daylight operations, acknowledging its potential. The critical ingenuity, forged out of sheer desperation above Schweinfurt in 1943, did not merely conclude with the cessation of World War II. Rather, it profoundly reshaped the very paradigm of aerial ordnance delivery. Upon the war's conclusion, when astute analysts meticulously compiled the comprehensive United States Strategic Bombing Survey, they unearthed an astonishing revelation within the meticulously gathered data. Over the 12-month period between January and December 1944, as offset bombing became ubiquitous across the 8th Air Force, the aggregate bomb weight deployed over Germany surged by an astounding 340%, concurrently with a remarkable 190% sharpening of bombing precision. This meant more munitions were being dropped, and a significantly higher proportion of them were striking their intended objectives. This potent combination irrevocably shattered German industrial production capabilities in a manner that the indiscriminate bombardments of the early war years could never have achieved. The advent of the Cold War era further elevated offset techniques, transitioning them from an immediate battlefield imperative into a foundational geopolitical methodology. When the Air Force commenced meticulous planning for potential nuclear strikes in the 1950s, the imperative for accuracy became paramount, a matter of national survival. A conventional explosive, missing its target by a mile, simply squandered material and effort. Conversely, a nuclear weapon veering off course by the same distance carried the catastrophic potential of striking an unintended urban center. Consequently, Air Force bombing schools instituted the teaching of offset geometry as a core pedagogical principle, deeming it equivalent in importance to mastering the fundamentals of aircraft takeoff and landing. Every bomber pilot within Strategic Air Command was expected to instinctively compute offset angles, even under duress, because their rigorous training presupposed they would be tasked with delivering atomic weapons through formidable Soviet air defenses, where any attempt at straight-in approaches guaranteed annihilation. The intricate mathematics underpinning offset bombing progressively advanced in tandem with technological innovation. When the iconic B-52 Stratofortress became operational in 1955, it integrated sophisticated radar bombing systems that fundamentally served as self-operating offset computation devices. Specifically, the N/ASQ-38 bombing navigation system possessed the advanced capability to discern critical radar reference points, accurately compute wind drift, ascertain optimal offset angles, and even autonomously execute the bombing approach. The bombardiers' critical role, consequently, transitioned from arduous hand computation to systematic oversight and management of these automated systems. Yet, despite these technological leaps, the fundamental tenet remained rooted in Robert Williams's serendipitous insight to harness the pervasive crosswind drift as an advantage, transforming it into a strategic weapon rather than perpetually contending against its adverse effects. The conflict in Vietnam conclusively demonstrated the efficacy of offset bombing within a starkly contrasting operational theater. The monsoon winds prevalent over North Vietnam were tempestuous and erratic, presenting atmospheric challenges far exceeding anything encountered over Germany. Formations of B-52s, tasked with bombing segments of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, would meticulously vector towards their objectives using offset angles derived from contemporaneous atmospheric data gathered by specialized weather reconnaissance aircraft. These heavy bombers were deploying ordnance from altitudes of 30,000 feet, navigating through winds that occasionally surpassed 150 miles per hour, yet they consistently maintained precision that rendered the disruption of enemy supply routes efficacious. Subsequent damage assessment flights confirmed that arc-light missions, the operational designation for these B-52 raids, registered mean circular error probabilities, CEPs, consistently below 1,500 feet, remarkable given the profoundly challenging environmental conditions. Despite these arduous circumstances, a new paradigm emerged with the advent of precision-guided munitions, which ostensibly rendered offset bombing superfluous. The prevailing question became, why meticulously compute intricate wind vectors when one could simply deploy a laser-guided bomb capable of autonomously adjusting its trajectory with pinpoint accuracy? The first Gulf War in 1991 dramatically showcased weapons capable of navigating with surgical exactitude into minute apertures, such as ventilation shafts. In response, numerous military analysts confidently proclaimed the cessation of an epoch defined by manual bombing computations. They firmly believed that advanced computers and global positioning system (GPS) technology would now comprehensively manage all targeting requirements henceforth. However, this presumption proved erroneous, as these experts neglected to account for the ever-evolving domain of electronic warfare. Contemporary air defense systems do more than merely engage aerial platforms kinetically. They possess the capability to disrupt satellite navigation transmissions, deceive sophisticated guidance mechanisms, and engineer electromagnetic landscapes where precision weapons are effectively neutralized, reverting to unguided projectiles. When global positioning system signals are successfully jammed, the operational scenario reverts abruptly to the core strategic dilemma faced in 1943. How does one accurately strike a designated objective when advanced systems are rendered inoperable? The solution that the modern Air Force has profoundly reaffirmed is, remarkably, offset bombing. Contemporary operational protocol for satellite navigation contested operational zones now rigorously instructs flight teams to leverage distinct radar signatures as offset reference points, to determine atmospheric displacement through manual computation, and to deploy ordnance by geometric principles rather than relying on satellite coordinates. Even the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, widely regarded as the pinnacle of aerospace engineering, has offset bombing calculations integrated within its operational programming, not merely as a contingency measure, but as a principal method for specific tactical scenarios. When infiltrating heavily fortified territories, where the activation of active targeting systems would inevitably betray its clandestine nature, non-emissive offset methodologies enable engagements without generating any detectable emissions. Operators discern critical reference points utilizing advanced synthetic aperture radar systems, then meticulously compute the precise offset vector that strategically aligns atmospheric currents to their advantage. Following this, they deploy ordnance and exfiltrate rapidly. Crucially, the adversary remains utterly unaware of their presence or the impending attack until the concussive impact of munitions commences. Even the domain of unmanned aerial vehicle operations employs offset principles. Operators of Reaper and Predator drones, when contending with powerful upper atmospheric currents, will occasionally implement offset targeting coordinates for their Hellfire missile attacks. While the weapon's internal navigation system manages the terminal phase of engagement, the primary launch parameters utilize offset geometry to position the ordnance within the general vicinity of the target. This methodology proves both expeditious and more economical in terms of propellant consumption, as it negates the necessity for the missile to expend energy battling lateral atmospheric forces throughout its entire trajectory. This ingenious technique has, in essence, returned to its genesis, vividly illustrating the timeless adage of exigency fostering ingenious solutions. Contemporary strategic architects, meticulously preparing for potential confrontations with technologically sophisticated counterparts, now routinely presuppose the disruption or complete absence of satellite navigation capabilities. Consequently, they are diligently instructing aircrews in the art of manual offset ordnance delivery, with a rigor unparalleled since the pivotal year of 1944. Aviation academies are once more imparting the intricate methodologies of wind vector computations, and designated training grounds are facilitating comprehensive offset approach drills, underscoring this renewed emphasis. Evidently, certain strategists within the Pentagon, having consulted the comprehensive after-action reports from D-Day, discern the persistent efficacy of traditional methodologies when contemporary systems falter. Robert Williams and Charles Murphy, the originators of this technique, could scarcely have envisioned that their initial navigational miscalculation would profoundly impact military engagements 8 decades hence. Yet, this exemplifies how authentic ingenuity operates. It resolves the pressing challenge with such innate grace and effectiveness that its utility becomes indelible, transcending generations. The ingenious practice of delivering ordnance laterally and harnessing atmospheric currents as a primary force transcended the confines of a mere tactical ploy from World War II. It represented a profound conceptual breakthrough, offering a fundamental insight into the interplay of physics and geometry, and demonstrating how to effectively transform ambient meteorological phenomena into instruments of warfare. Consequently, each meticulously executed offensive anywhere in the world today, irrespective of whether it is guided by satellite navigation or manually calculated, bears an indelible debt to that momentous and somewhat disoriented October dawn over Schweinfurt, when an aircrew, having misdirected their attack, inadvertently struck the intended objective with devastating precision.